Hello, my name is Francesca and I'm with Evergreen Stormwater, and this is the Chapter 8 training video for the Stormwater Guidance Manual Strategies for Privately Owned BMPs. This chapter describes different enforcement mechanisms permittees can employ when BMP owners fail to comply with inspection and maintenance requirements. So both the Eastern Washington and Western Washington Phase 2 permit require permittees to implement some type of enforcement strategy for the inspection and maintenance of BMPs on private property. Enforcing BMP maintenance is important because it helps us ensure these BMPs continue to function as designed, and it also helps keep permittees in compliance with their respective permits. Another benefit is that it allows permittees to recover costs resulting from when a permittee must go out and maintain and or repair an unmaintained BMP. So the hot topic with enforcement mechanisms right now is progressive enforcement. So this is in both the Eastern Washington and Western Washington permits. For example, in Western Washington this past year, permittees were required to develop a source control program, and a part of that program was developing a progressive enforcement policy. And then in the Eastern Washington manual, you see progressive enforcement requirements with items like inspecting and maintaining these private BMPs. So the progressive enforcement, the MS4 permit dictates that it must be there, but it does not dictate exactly what it looks like. So it is up to you, the permittee, to develop what actions in the sequence of these actions that are best suited for you and your jurisdictional needs. So with progressive enforcement, the actions just need to increase in severity as property owners are not responsive or based on the degree of threat to public safety and environmental harm. So on that note, that permittees do have the right by jurisdictional code or often written in their policy to skip preliminary enforcement actions to a suitable penalty if the violation does warrant immediate action. So what the MS4 permit does say is that they emphasize education and technical assistance must come first. So really what this is therefore so that permittees don't just go out, see a maintenance issue on a private property and just slap that owner with a fine and walk away. Instead, this encourages permittees to work with the property owner to help find a solution to these maintenance issues with the hopes that it prevents this noncompliance to happen again. So we're going to go ahead and walk through different enforcement actions and what they look like, and just give you some options of what you can use to develop your policy. So the first one is education and technical assistance. Again, this is when the permit provides that education and technical assistance to support the property owner in correcting the identified issue. And that goal is to educate the property owner to prevent future non-compliance. So this looks like the property owner training either during a site visit, or just providing technical resources when the property owner is in need. So when I was talking to permittees while developing this manual, most said that the education technical assistance step is all that was needed. Very rarely did they have to actually escalate to other enforcement actions. So just keep that in mind. I think with property owners, a lot of the times they don't even realize the BMP is on their property or what the proper maintenance looks like. So just taking that first step may solve the issue. If not, the next step you often see is a notice of correction. So this is when a permittee issues a notice of correction to the responsible party when the permittee becomes aware of conditions that are non-compliant during any inspection that is not a technical assistance visit. So during this step, often permittees give property owners the opportunity to enter into a voluntary compliance agreement. And this is a written and signed commitment by the responsible party for the violation, agreeing to correct that violation. And during this step, often it does not include any civil or criminal penalties, which we'll talk a little bit later. Notice of violation and order. So the permittee issues a notice of violation or notice and order to the responsible party when the permittee identifies a violation of the applicable stormwater code, or if the voluntary compliance agreement has not been met. So during this step, permittees may decide to administer a civil and penalty with the notice of violation. Then you have a stop work order or a cease and desist order. So permittees issue a stop work order or a cease and desist order to the responsible party when the permittee identifies a violation or continued violation of the applicable stormwater code. So this order requires the responsible party to halt operation and take appropriate remedial action. So this step often does come with some type of civil or criminal penalty. And then this is also employed when you find a violation that's causing risk to public harm or the environment. So civil and administrative penalties, this is a non-criminal remedy for violating the law and is generally in the form of fines or other financial payments. So the MS4 permit abides by the Code of Federal Regulation 40 CFR 12241, and this sets the maximum fines for violating any of these permit conditions. They have a criminal penalty, which is a punishment imposed on a person who violates the law. So this is generally in the form of fines or other financial payments, losing or surrendering property, and imprisonment. And then lastly, in addition with all of these other enforcement actions that the permittee may decide to implement cost recovery, which would be charging the responsible party for the costs of pursuing code compliance and abatement incurred to correct a violation upon issuing a notice and order or a stop work order. So another thing, this may look like placing a lien against the property to ensure that the jurisdiction recovers all of the costs for penalties as well as repairs and maintenance and any attorney or legal fees. So like I mentioned, the MS4 permit abides by the Code of Federal Regulation 40 CFR 12241. And so this sets the maximum permit fine violations and fines for both civil and criminal penalties. So you can see on the screen, the maximum fines for civil penalties is not to exceed 10,000 per violation for a class 1 violation, up with a maximum of not to exceed 25,000. And then class 2, you can see it's that similar 10,000 per day, but then the maximum amount of any class 2 penalty not to exceed 125,000. For criminal violations, these are broken into 3 different categories. You have negligent violations, knowing violations, or imminent danger violations. So this ranges from $2,500 to $25,000 a day, or up to 1 year imprisonment, to $250,000 a day, or up to 15 years of imprisonment, or both. So I'll let you take a moment to see these different fines for these different types of violations. So permittees across Washington state utilize different civil penalty structures. Again, the MS4 permit does not dictate what this looks like. So it's up to each jurisdiction to develop what best suits their needs. When I was looking and talking to different permittees, I found that there were 3 common structures for these civil penalties. So this was a max min per day and or violation, an escalating penalty, or a penalty matrix. So again, up to the jurisdiction to decide what they want to develop, and again, consult with your legal counsel early and often through this whole process. So now we'll go ahead and walk through each of these common structures. The first one we have is a maximum per day and or violation. This is when the permittee administers a fine and or maximum fine either per day, a minimum and or maximum fine either per day or per day per violation. So on the screen, you can see examples from both Western Washington and Eastern Washington. And what I saw was most common was a fine of up to $1,000 per day or per violation. The next structure we have is an escalating penalty. So this fine is administered by permittees, increases in value per day or per violation. So the city of Spokane Valley has an excellent example of this in their code. As you can see, for the first violation, the civil penalty is $500. The second separate violation within a 3-year period is $1,000, and then each subsequent separate violation within a 3-year period is $2,000. Lastly, we have a penalty matrix. This is the least common penalty structure, and I actually did not come across any phase 2 permittees that implement this, but I did want to highlight it because it is an option. So 2 phase 1 permittees that use this are the City of Seattle and King County. So this is when the permittees assess violations and determine fines using a point system. So there are generally different categories that you're assessing. So for example, if there's environmental or resource damage, if there's any action that's been taken to remedy the problem, if the violation was willful or knowing, and then if the violator has any type of compliance history. So for each of these categories, you are assigning a point system. There's a point system and you're assigning points. And then to determine the fine, you sum the points from each category. And this is associated with some type of dollar value. So there are examples in Appendix 8A of the guidance manual that give more details on the penalty structures for both the City of Seattle and King County. So we're going to talk a little bit about developing enforcement programs and enforcement procedures. So successfully designed enforcement procedures should encourage B&P owners to respond in a timely manner when a permittee identifies noncompliance. One key component to this is very detailed and comprehensive documentation. So this prevents confusion. It also promotes consistent response to violations, especially if there are multiple code enforcement officers, and then also helps protect the permittee during different stormwater violation disputes. And if you do have to employ enforcement actions, these should occur quickly and follow your established procedures. So we're going to walk through 3 recommended elements when developing enforcement programs to consider. The first one is evaluating existing procedures. So many MS4 permittees already have some type of established enforcement procedure for other stormwater programs. So this may be for construction site inspections, IDDE, or as I mentioned earlier in Western Washington, the source control programs. So the first thing you want to do is to assess if your existing enforcement procedures are appropriate for private B&P maintenance and inspection, and if you can roll this program into your existing enforcement strategy. If that is the case, you will also need to consider who will be responsible for the enforcement. So if there are other code enforcement officers already in different programs or different departments, they may have the capacity to take on this work. If they do, you will need to consider what additional training may be required. I have to imagine that doing code enforcement for building code is going to look different and require different knowledge than enforcing inspection and maintenance of B&Ps on private property. So make sure you're providing your staff with the knowledge that they need. If there is not capacity for someone at your jurisdiction to take that on, you will need to go through the appropriate legal avenues to grant authority to someone in your stormwater department. If you do have to develop a new set of enforcement actions, you're going to evaluate the different enforcement actions and sequences and decide what is best for your jurisdiction. So that's also going to include establishing any civil or criminal penalty structures and what the criteria and process is for assessing and imposing those penalties. Like I mentioned, consult with legal early and often through this entire process. Once you have developed your enforcement strategy, it is essential to document these actions and penalties through different regulatory mechanisms. So Chapter 7 covers regulatory mechanisms. As I mentioned in Chapter 7, the strongest of these is ordinances. So you want to use ordinances for documenting the sequence and actions of these penalties. Then if you have any supplemental material, so for example, if you decide to develop a penalty matrix and that process, the details of that penalty matrix and the process for assessing those points for the different categories, that type of information is better suited in a public rule or policy. So keep your ordinances cleaner by keeping those details in a different type of documentation. Lastly, you're going to want to establish some type of documenting and tracking process. So both MS4 permits require permittees to track the enforcement actions that have been taken. So this is going to include notices of correction, notices of violation, and other enforcement records. And this has to be submitted as a part of your annual report each year. You'll also want to be providing providing written documentation to property owners for each step in your progressive enforcement strategy. This is important, A, so that you are informing the property owner what will happen if they do not remedy the situation. But then it also provides a written trail for you, and shows ecology that you're putting your best foot forward to try to keep these property owners and these BMPs in compliance. So during our workshop, we asked two questions regarding enforcement mechanisms. The first one was, does your jurisdiction utilize progressive enforcement procedures for maintaining and inspecting BMPs on private property? Of the 18 respondents, 72% said yes, 17% said no, and 11% were unsure. The follow-up question was, if yes, how often does your jurisdiction implement enforcement actions beyond education and technical assistance? So 53% of the 19 respondents said almost never, which supports what we were talking about earlier. 42% said sometimes, and 5% said unsure.